People in Topeka love a garage sale.
Yes, they
just
do.
Just for the record, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people like garage sales. And Gage Boulevard is a busy street. But I couldn't even drive down the street. People were like in our yard, in the neighbor's yard, like walking across the street.
Welcome to TBC Extra, a weekly podcast of our Sunday sermon and a little extra. I am Teresa Jenkins, the communications director here at Topeka Bible Church.
And I'm Jason Brent, the children's pastor at Topeka Bible Church, and we're glad you're here. And now for a little extra.
All right. Hey, we're here today. Thank you for joining us. Alan and I are kind of doing this for at least this part solo.
Yes.
Alan, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right.
It's interesting
Very busy.
looking over there where the cameras are and not seeing you there.
Right.
Seeing you here. And Teresa was unable to make it today, so we'll do our best to hold down the fort for this first section.
Yes, we will.
But we had I felt like a very interesting and to me challenging sermon this week about generous giving, not just wanting to give because it's a requirement or duty, but out of the gracious of our heart, and also with the understanding of how much Christ has given us out of the surplus that God's given us.
Right.
And so we were kind of talking about this before, and I thought it would kind of be a neat thing if we talked about or asked you a question. Have there ever been a time when somebody's given to you generously?
Yeah.
I know we're supposed to be generous givers to God, and
Right.
that's what we were talking about, but you know the old adage, it's better to give than receive.
But the interesting thing is that as soon as you asked me that and proposed that as the question that we answer, at first I thought it was going to be really difficult to come up with something, and then immediately things started popping up. So I think it kind of goes to show how when you're generous, it sticks in people's head.
Yeah, good point.
Like the example I'm going to give here, it's been years and years and years and years since it's happened, but I still remember it clear as day, and it immediately came to mind when you brought it to. My head.
Well, what was that? What was that situation then?
So I was finishing up with this like touring music group thing that I did in college.
The vocals or the guitarist?
I was behind the scenes doing tech stuff.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
Sure.
I thought probably, but
yeah. So we were wrapping up with our summer tour for that. And there was a dilemma where one of the people on my team was going to get married, but there was only so much time for me and I was going to be close to the school.
Yeah. Which
is in Ohio, and I'm from Topeka, Kansas.
Sure.
So, but there was only like a week of time or so for me to figure out the next school year. Mm-hmm. It was probably 2 weeks. The next school year, but I also wanted to go to this wedding.
Sure.
And I was pretty distraught about my choices at this point. But one of the
choices were to not go to the wedding.
Yes.
And go to school.
Well, go to school eventually, but that was kind of like the deadline.
Sure.
But I wanted to go home and get ready.
Gotcha.
Which it's kind of hard to explain. But overall, I was considering not going to the wedding, which was a bummer.
Yeah.
One of the other people on my team, his name's Luke, and this sticks out in my head. He ended up buying for me my plane ticket there and back, and let me stay with his family's house that entire time I was there in Ohio.
Yeah.
And I mean, that just sticks in my head.
A plane ticket from Kansas City to Ohio and back?
And back.
Yeah, wow.
So that allowed me to then go there.
And he wasn't the one getting married.
Right.
He wasn't
he was not the one getting married.
That's crazy.
Yes. So yeah, that sticks out as just like, that's like
and
a couple $100
you didn't have to drive all the way
ticket.
there, waste the time, that kind of thing.
Yeah, because the entire time I was going to college, I was driving there and back to Ohio and Kansas, and doing that would have been impossible without him intervening so generously.
Did it make it every time you had to drive there? Back there and back
a little bit
that,
more miserable.
like man, I could have just flown.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Luke, where you at? No.
Yeah, I just had so much stuff because you'd be moving into a dorm room and you had all your junk with you.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
Boarding that on a plane was pretty difficult. But.
Yeah, that is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, man, there's been so many times that people have been generous to me or my family, but the one that stuck out the most to me was the first time we adopted. And so international adoption is fairly expensive and can be very expensive, and it takes a long time. And so most people will either raise funds or borrow money or that kind of thing. Well, my wife decided, and I don't know why she thought this would be fun, but she thought we should have a garage sale. But to me, a garage sale would have been just like a drop in the bucket compared to how much money we needed to adopt. But she was like, no, I want us to be like a big garage sale. And so many people donated to our garage sale.
Oh.
And they were like giving us stuff that some of it was really, really good stuff that was probably like an extra refrigerator or like that kind of thing. In fact, they donated so much stuff to us that our house got filled up. Like we had a 2-story house. We could barely make it through. We had a path through our whole house and our garage and our driveway with tarps and stuff on it. We're totally just packed full. And this wasn't really deceptive. It's going to sound like it when I tell this, but my wife, I don't think, was trying to deceive me. Okay. But at the church I was working at before, Topeka Bible Church, there was a mission trip, and they needed people to drive people to the mission trip to the airport at 4 a.m. And so I volunteered to do that. And so I left at 4 a.m, was coming back from Kansas City about 6 o'clock, and as I drove down Gage Boulevard, which is the street we lived on at the time, I saw people. I'm like, man, it's early. People are having a party. And I realized that my wife had decided that we had too much stuff. She was going to start the sale early. And so she just decided that morning, because I got up at 4 and I guess she didn't go back to sleep, she was going to start setting up for the garage sale. And people in Topeka love a garage sale.
Yes, they do.
Just for the record, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people like garage sales. And Gage Boulevard is a busy street. But I couldn't even drive down the street. People were like in our yard, in the neighbor's yard, like walking across the street, coming across from the Gage Park. I had a park in Gage Park. And what had happened is that she decided to start set up. So she set a garage sale sign up and started trying to pull these things out with her and her mom. And people were coming, seeing the garage sale sign, realized what was happening, and these strangers just started setting the garage sale up. And they were setting things up, asking where the things, everything had been priced, everything had been, but they needed to set up, like, where do you want this table? Where do you want this? And like, it was to say this was a big garage sale is an understatement. I'll try to find a picture of it. We can maybe include it in the show notes. This was a huge garage sale.
Garage sale.
But these strangers were like, I'm here to buy this Afghan, but I stayed for 2 hours to help set up.
Wow.
And many people did that. And through that whole garage sale, people were donating their time, their effort, their stuff to sell. And it was just quite amazing. And we ended up making $5,000 from this garage sale, which is a pretty big garage sale when you're thinking like 25 cents for a shirt or whatever. So
I normally think like you're making maybe a couple $100.
That's what I thought when my wife decided we're going to have a garage sale for raising funds. Yeah.
Wow. 5,000. That's huge.
Yeah, it was huge. But just, we couldn't have done it without other people and all their kindness. So,
awesome. Well, that will go right into what it looks like to giving to things like the church or those in need, and that will be talked about in today's message.
Many of you know this. I used to work as the youth pastor, both here, but also back in a little church in Runaway Bay, Texas, which is a real city. And in that little city, we had a wonderful little church. It was about 100 people. And for the background of the lead pastor is sort of a story in and of itself there, but for various reasons, he was fixated on the topic of money. And so we had an entire month every year at the church devoted to stewardship, and it was a frequent topic of his sermons and illustrations. And so the time came for our entire church to go on a mission trip. We went to New Mexico, and as a part of that mission trip, everybody was, it was a construction thing, and so we needed a lot of folks from our church to take materials and tools and things like that, and their pickup trucks and trailers to the site in New Mexico. And so everybody was told, go and use your equipment and then let us know how much it cost, and when you come back, we'll reimburse you. And so everybody goes on the trip, and we all come back, and it comes time to reimburse everybody. And the pastor brings me aside and says, we don't have enough money to reimburse everybody. And he knew that before going on the trip. But he says, the only people we're going to reimburse are those who tithe to the church. So I bring that up because this morning we're going to be in chapters 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians, which talk all about generosity and giving. And that situation back in Runaway Bay was unethical and manipulative and deceptive, and it was ultimately the thing that made me go and look for a different job. But I know that there are a lot of you who have had bad experiences or have bad ideas about sermons that relate to giving. But as we get into this topic this morning, there are two convictions that situation in Runaway Bay gave me. And that first conviction is that here at TBC, I made the decision a while back that though I'm pretty intimately involved in the formation of our church budget, I don't want to know how much anybody in the church gives. And so I never wanted to be tempted, just because I had seen that, to treat somebody differently based upon how much or how little they give to our mission. And so, if I make eye contact with you today, it has nothing to do with that. But the second thing is, nevertheless, I do feel very strongly that giving is something that at times is appropriate to discuss because the Bible discusses it. And so this morning, just in our walk through 2 Corinthians, we've come to a point in time where we need to discuss it. And I still recognize that this isn't everybody's favorite topic, right? I'm pretty sure I could do, race and politics, gender and sexuality. We could talk about any number of things, and you would still say this is probably the least favorite thing to discuss. But we're not going to do it for 2 weeks. There's enough content to do it for 2 weeks. So instead, this morning, we just have a longer message on 2 full chapters in 2 Corinthians about this topic. And here's my hope as we discuss this, is that you would have a greater appreciation for the generosity that God has shown to you. That's my hope. So, if you will, let's begin in chapter 8. Verse 1. Paul says, "We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. During a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. I can testify that according to their ability, and even beyond their ability, of their own accord, they begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry of the saints, and not just as we had hoped. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by God's will. So we urged Titus that just as he had begun, so he should also complete among you this act of grace." So for those who are a little lost, as we just sort of roll into chapter 8, Paul is referencing something back in 1 Corinthians 16. It was how he finished his letter. And what's going on is the church in Jerusalem is being persecuted, and for various reasons, they're struggling financially. And so Paul has told the Corinthians about this situation, and this is critical, they have asked Paul to be a part of giving to the church in Jerusalem. They have said they wanted to take part in sort of creating a gift and gathering a gift that then would be sent back to the church there. And so back in 1 Corinthians 16, Paul gives some ground rules. He says, all right, so I suggest that what you do is set aside a certain amount of money weekly that is in proportion with how you are prospering. That's what he says. So that when he returns, that he can gather it and it won't be compulsory. He's like, so you've already set it aside so that when I come back, it's not like collection time, but rather we can gather it together and I can take it. But apparently, at some point, the Corinthian desire to gather this money together has relaxed. Their passion for the church in Jerusalem has sort of waned. And so, presumably, when Titus delivered that third painful letter, he witnessed that they had sort of slowed down this eager process that they had once begun. And so Paul, hearing this, is now going to spend 2 chapters basically encouraging them. And a huge part of this has nothing to do with how much money the Corinthian church can give, but the reason by which they are giving in the first place. And so that is what really he focuses on. And to begin with, he lifts up the churches in Macedon. And so Macedon is sort of the northern part of Greece, and that would include Thessalonica, that would most likely include Philippi. And what's going on is in that region of northern Greece, there's severe persecution as well. From the very beginning, the churches of Christ were being attacked greatly. And so what is going on is this church in Macedon has nevertheless asked, they said, we want the privilege, they say, of sharing in the ministry to the saints. So they've also asked Paul for this. And not just the privilege of taking part in this, right? So they even see it as something that is a boon to them. But Paul says that they have gone above and beyond even his greatest hopes. That his expectation for them was sort of a certain level, which he'll explain to the Corinthians later, but that the churches of Macedon have gone far above that. And the 2 reasons why he's so impressed is, one, he says here, because of their abundant joy. He says they were so excited. It was like they were beating down his doors to give money to Jerusalem. He says they had abundant joy to be able to give to the saints in Jerusalem. And also because of their severe poverty. This is the thing that ultimately impresses Paul so much, is that their desire to give went over and above the sort of lessons and the guidelines that are presented by proportional giving. And so he lifts up the church at Macedon, and he says that they, at the very sort of the second to last sentence here, says they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by God's will. And he says, so this is not because I went and asked them for money. He says they've done this of their own accord, and it is because they've understood, as he's about to explain, what it means to respond to the gospel message. So we urge Titus that just as he had begun, so he should also complete among you this act of grace. And you're also going to see that as we continue on through this, Paul does not use the word money in 2 whole chapters to describe collecting money. It's actually pretty impressive. He's got quite the thesaurus. But instead he uses things like it's a ministry of grace. It's an act of love. It's generosity. It's a ministry to the saints. It's all of these things that draws people away from the dollars and cents and more into the why. As we go on, though, the focus becomes less about Macedon and instead the reason why the churches in Macedonia were so excited. And it's because they reflected on what God had given to them first. Paul says, now as you excel in everything, in faith, speech, knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love for us, excel also in this act of grace. I'm not saying this as a command. Rather, by means of the diligence of others, I'm testing the genuineness of your love. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And in this matter, I am giving advice because it is profitable to you, who began last year not only to do something, but also to want to do it. That last sentence there, he's referencing their desire. He's like, you, again, like, you were the ones who said that you wanted to do this. So now let's talk about this, right? Anybody who has begun a good work and then has sort of failed down the back stretch, we want to encourage them. That's what he's doing. He says, I'm not commanding you to do anything. In the New Testament, and this is a significant shift from the Old, but in the New Testament, there's never some compulsory giving that is required. He says everything is flowing out of a heart of generosity. And to share that example, he says, first we look to Christ, who showed us humility. And, you know, if you look at Isaiah 53 or we look at the Gospels, we understand from an emotional sense that Christ was humiliated, right? That he was led a difficult life, even though he never sinned, and he was sick, and he was looked down upon, and of course, the very end of his life, the sacrifice for the entire world, Jesus on the cross. But theologically, there's actually kind of another step that you take. And this is in the book of Philippians, which says that Christ, being the second member of the Trinity, being eternally begotten by the Father and existing for all time, when he descended, we use the word incarnation. This is what we celebrate at Christmas. The little baby in the manger is a theological concept. That was an act of humility of God, because he gave up, and that's the debate, what exactly did he give up? But he gave up some of the rights that he has as the Son when he took on human flesh. And so Paul is drawing back to this claim, not that Jesus was materially poor, though he most likely was, but rather that he, of his spirit, was willing to be humbled and to sacrifice so that others might gain. This is what an church father named Gregory of Nazianzus said in about 300 AD. This poor sap had one of those Byzantine sort of photos that just gives him a balloon head. But he says, Christ was made poor that we through his poverty might be rich. He took the form of a servant that we might regain liberty. He descended that we might be exalted. He was tempted that we might overcome. He was despised that he might fill us with glory. He died that we might be saved. He ascended to draw to himself those lying prostrate or down on the ground through sin's stumbling block. And so Gregory's point here is that we look to Christ first and foremost as the par example of one who sacrificed so that others might benefit. And that is shown first and foremost, right, through his death on the cross. And so as Christians then who are following after this thing and desire to be like Christ and are responding to the gospel message that says we have received the free gift of God's grace if we accept Jesus as our Savior, Paul says this is really the engine that's driving us. It's not so much about, the perception. It's not about, like in Greek culture at the time, if you're a patron, okay, your name would be placed on the buildings in very similar ways to our culture of philanthropy today, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but Paul says there's no part of giving within God's kingdom that is for your glory. And so that's a hard message for the church in Corinth, but he says, if you get, though, the message of the gospel, this idea of generosity presented to you through the cross, he says, then you're going to kind of follow a different path as you begin to think about these things. And so Paul continues to emphasize, he says, this is not a command. Instead, he likens it to a test. He says, I'm not saying this as a command. Rather, by means of the diligence of others, I'm testing the genuineness of your love. And we don't like that. We don't like the idea that this would be a test. But there are many tests that our walk of faith produces in us. Every single day, you experience tests. You experience opportunities where you can choose one way or the other. And by choosing the path that draws us closer to Christ, you inevitably pass the test. You pass the test that displays that God's work in your life is manifesting itself and making you look more and more like Jesus every single day. And so this idea of a test, don't go back to, high school or college when we were studying all night, but rather it's a simple thing. The answer is clear, right? We want to look more like Jesus every day. And so through Paul, he says, we must follow this act of grace. But finally, as he points out at the beginning of this passage here, and you know this if you walked with us through 1 Corinthians last fall, the Corinthians are a very gifted church. This becomes a part of the whole discussion in chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians on spiritual gifts, but long story short, they do a lot of things well. They're smart, they're attractive, they're wealthy, they speak well, they are wise teachers, there's prophecy and speaking in tongues in the church in Corinth, and they're pretty fascinated by it. And so Paul points to these things, and he says, look, you've benefited really in so many different ways. God's grace upon your life has shown itself in a lot of things that you love to be a part of. And he says, but this act of grace, he says, make sure you follow through with this as well. It should be included in the collection of things that are motivated by the Spirit. Okay, so then the question comes, how much, right? This is the practical question. So how much, Paul? How much would you like us to give? We're motivated by the generosity that we see in Jesus Christ. We get it. You're not telling us to do this. We are compelled. We are motivated. How much? Now also finish the task, Paul says, so that just as there was an eager desire, there may also be a completion according to what you have. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. It is not that there should be relief for others and hardship for you, but it is a question of equality. At the present time, your surplus is available for their need, so that their abundance may in turn meet your need, in order that there may be equality. As it is written, the person who had much did not have too much, and the person who had little did not have too little. So there are two primary drivers for answering the question of how much in the New Testament world and the church age that we have. The first is proportionality, and the second is equality. Let's talk about the first one. Multiple times, this is in 1 Corinthians, this is here in this passage, Paul says that the way that we should give is in keeping with, as he says in 1 Corinthians, how we are prospering. Here he says the gift is acceptable according to what a person has, and then he continues on, right? Not according to what he does not have. So the idea here is not actually one of tithing, and this is going to kind of like rock a couple worlds, because tithing is not a New Testament concept. It is the shorthand we sometimes use to talk about giving to the church. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with the word offering, but tithing is an Old Testament concept that has very specific rules and regulations attached to how much people are to give, and it's also normative. It's the exact same for everybody. Everybody is supposed to do the exact same when they are tithing. When we get to the New Testament, we still see that there's this idea of proportional giving or a percentage, but it is not attached to a specific amount. And you're like, okay, well, then what's the problem in saying tithing? Well, if tithing is traditionally 10%, and there's a whole lot of math that makes it out to be more than that in the Old Testament, the truth is that in our world today, there are plenty of people who can give more than 10% and still be perfectly content in many of the ways that they are living and even afford some luxuries in life. This is true in the Corinthian church. He mentions it here that there is a surplus that they have and they're able to give it to the church in Jerusalem. But also, there are slaves in the Corinthian church, people who are saving up their money for their emancipation. And so the idea that they would be consistently giving at the exact same amount as the wealthy, business owners in the Corinthian church doesn't make sense. That would be depriving them of their freedom ultimately, but also it would be a hardship for them. And so the first thing that we see is in this idea of how much is that there's still this concept of a ratio or a proportion that is in keeping time with how income increases or changes, but nevertheless, there's not a specific answer. Paul is essentially giving a guideline, a theme, and he's saying, let your generosity figure out where you land in that space. So for some it is more, for some it is less, but it is proportional. But the other thing that we see is this idea of equality, this second principle. And people can get really hung up on the idea of equality, right? They can attach other words to it than the ones that the Bible is using. But Paul has a completely reasonable statement there at the end. He says, as it is written, the person who had much did not have too much, and the person who had little did not have too little. Not everybody is going at the exact same line. Some will have more, some will have less. But we're reducing the extremes. And this is specifically within the kingdom of God's family with his brothers and sisters in Christ. John Calvin says, nobody hoards his abundance at another's expense in the church. To drive home that concept, Paul, that phrase at the very end when he says, as it is written, it begins right here. This is actually quoting Exodus 16, verses 18 through 20. Paul is referencing a passage in Exodus where God was introducing the theme of manna to the Israelites, right? Manna, the bread that sustained them day by day as they were going through the desert and their exodus from Egypt, it had some rules. And one of the rules with manna was that you only collected the amount each day that you needed to eat for that day. And then right before the Sabbath, you would collect twice as much so that you didn't have to go out and collect on the Sabbath. And so this phrase, the person who had much did not have too much, and the person who had little did not have too little, was originally talking about those who went out and were able to collect as much manna as they wanted, as long as they were able to eat it and use it that day. There was surplus. If they had a surplus, though, if they collected more than what was necessary, Bible quiz, what happened to it the next day? It rotted and had maggots in it. Exciting, right? Yeah. And so you also understand now the context that Paul is bringing forth here. This is in no way demeaning people who have wealth, but rather he's saying there is a concept that we think of when it comes to how much wealth we have or how little wealth we have. That there's this idea of proportionality, there's this idea of equality when it comes to God's kingdom and our generosity. And so we never want to be those who are hoarding, as like I said, John Calvin, so that those in the church might suffer. But lest you think, though, that this is some like Robin Hood deal, right? Steal from the rich and give to the poor. That's not New Testament giving either. See, Paul isn't saying those who are poor are excluded from the giving, for the giving that they wanted to undertake, right? He showed Macedon and he said, now they went above and beyond these examples. Like they went above and beyond proportional giving because they're struggling mightily and they're still giving this significant gift. But nevertheless, Paul says this principle is for everybody because, and if this is something I can drive home this morning, I would love it. It is that we are not giving because we have money. We are giving because of the generosity of Christ. And so as we take these steps away from our bank accounts and into the gospel message, we say, well, if you have been affected by the gospel, then the generosity of Christ should be flowing through you. And then these guidelines that Paul presents are things that help you to determine what it looks like to be generous. So as we move away, this is not Robin Hood, but rather there is equality even in who is giving, and that it's everybody. So how much, right? Paul doesn't give a satisfying answer. And in fact, in the New Testament, if you're looking for how as Christians today much you should be giving, you're not going to find a satisfactory answer because it is through your heart that you determine this amount. And nobody is compelling you to do it because here in a second we're going to see that actually your heart in giving is far more important than the number of zeros attached to your check. So with that, let's turn to chapter 9. We'll be in verse 6. We have to skip a couple things. What you're skipping over is Paul's instruction about how he's going, like the technicalities of how he's going to collect the money when he comes next. But let's go to chapter 9. Verse 6, Paul says, the point is this, the person who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the person who sows generously will also reap generously. Each person should do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make every grace overflow to you, so that in every way, always having everything you need, you may excel in every good work. As it is written, he distributed freely, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. So Paul makes connections between giving and being a farmer, right? And I mean, we're in Kansas, so it's not like 6 degrees of separation if you know a farmer. It's you are one or somebody in your family probably is one. But when it comes to being a farmer, you understand that the seed that is planted at the beginning of the season is not a lost sort of bet, right? It is something that is going to produce results later on. And in fact, as a farmer, if you consistently try and save money by reducing the amount of seed that you are planting, when it comes time for harvest, you're going to realize that now your problem is only being compounded. You have much less to harvest. And so this concept of seed and harvest is one that Paul is going to now bring up when it comes to the idea of generosity. Here's the problem. Okay, not that we don't understand the principle of a farmer. What is the harvest? Because there are many churches in the prosperity sort of gospel realm that are going to use these verses specifically to talk about health, wealth, and success. They're going to say, if you give your seed gift, right, the storehouses of God are going to pour out upon you. All of the blessings of the Lord are going to come to you. All of the things that you've desired are going to be there. Churches in Houston that are in former NBA stadiums are saying these things all the time, right? Yet, what is the harvest in context? The harvest in context, you might be surprised, has nothing to do with you growing in material wealth. There is no concept biblically that if you give money, you are going to get richer. In fact, he addresses it. He says, if that does happen, if you are blessed materially because you give, he says it is only so that God might prepare you to be more generous in the future. It is not so that you might get into the next sort of phase of life, of living that you want. It's important to set aside here that God does bless people financially, right? It is just that there's responsibility associated with wealth. And this is one of those things that we talk about. When it comes to being generous, Paul says that they are reaping a harvest, but what kind of harvest? Well, it is a harvest of righteousness. And this is what he's going to spend some time developing. And so if we can, again, take a movement away from the dollars and cents and into the gospel here, what we're looking at is we say that the gospel of Jesus Christ and over the overarching lifestyle of somebody who is a Christian is one that is marked by sacrifice. It is one that is marked by a love for others before a love for self. And so as we look at these things and then we use that to understand Paul's idea of harvest here, we can see that the harvest then, we receive joy as other things grow and benefit because of the gift that we have received and now impart to other people. This is why Paul says this is an act of grace. It's a ministry to the saints. It's a blessing. It's a generous thing to do, not because we are benefiting, but because others are. There's an old English proverb that says, he who serves God for money will serve the devil for better wages. If you are a Christian because you are hoping to find worldly success, my friend, you're in the wrong gig. That's not what we do. So there are true benefits, though, to being a follower of Christ. I don't want to diminish that. It's just that we have to view them from the right angle. There are benefits to being a follower of Christ, absolutely. There are things that go beyond. You are forgiven of your sins and you are going to be in heaven with Jesus, right? There are an abundance of worldly things even we experience in this life. And this is what Paul's going to turn his attitude and direction or text towards next. Is he says there are in fact 6 separate things Paul's going to point out that you can rejoice in and find encouragement in through your giving. It's just not that you are being enriched materially. 6 separate things that he says that allow us to excel in these good works. When he quotes Psalm 112 at the end, as it is written, he distributed freely, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Paul is drawing us deeper into this place where he says, our focus is not on the temporal, meaning the things that perish, the things that rust and decay, eat away at, but on the future, our righteousness. Psalm 112 about the righteous man, the righteousness that does endure forever. Because when we give into God's kingdom, we are making investments into eternal things. So our final passage that we're looking at in this area of 2 Corinthians is where Paul gives these 6 separate things that we can find encouragement in. Not our personal growth financially necessarily. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but not that we rely on that as a reason to give. He says there are 6 things that draw our hearts deeper into the giving of Christ. Now, to the one who provides seed for the sower and bread for food will also provide and multiply your seed and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for all generosity, which produces thanksgiving to God through us. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Because of the proof provided by this ministry, and again, that's him talking about this gift. They will glorify God for your obedient confession of the gospel of Christ and for your generosity in sharing with them and with everyone. And as they pray on your behalf, they will have deep affection for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. So I don't know if you caught it. There are the 6, right? Number 1, that you can display stewardship. When he says that there is one who provides seed for the sower and bread for food. The concept of stewardship is not just like a synonym for giving. Stewardship is this concept that God has given to us everything and we give some of it back. That everything that we have, everything good that we have in our lives has come from our Father. And so this idea of the farmer is then extended, and it says it's not just that you plant seed, but rather there is one who has given you the seed to plant. And so instead of feeling like it is just, drawing from, all of the things that my hard work has achieved for me, we're instead able to release ourselves from that binding view of our finances, which is not biblical, and instead say, man, everything is coming from God. And so let me give back some of that. Back when I was in grade school, around Christmas time, we did this thing. I don't know if they still do it, but it was your parents would give you money to then go shop at the grade school for Christmas gifts for your parents, okay? And so they would have these tables set up in the gymnasium, and they had all of these just, odds and ends and trinkets and worthless stuff pretty much. I'm sure it was some fundraiser, it was way overpriced, but I would go in with $20 that my mom had given to me, and then I would go into this thing, and I would, as my third grade self, I'd be like, what does mom want? What does dad want with this? And so I would spend that money, and then I'd be able to take it home and have a gift that I had given to my parents, right, under the tree, right? Imagine if I just went to the quick shop, and as a third grader in this example, and spent $20. Imagine if I had kept some of that for myself. Imagine if I had not done what she intended for me to do with that money. This is stewardship in its own way. God has given you resources, and he has desires for you to do things with those resources. And we are not monks of the ancient ages. There is life to be enjoyed. Ecclesiastes says, have good, wine and food and rejoice with your friends in the life that God has given to you. Rejoice in the fruit of your labors. True. But this is what balances it as well. We have stewardship that we are able to display when we give. Number 2, your faith grows. Paul says it increases the harvest of your righteousness. As we draw deeper and deeper into this idea of generosity, one of the things that happens is that it draws us deeper and deeper into our relationship with Christ. As you continue to, with proportionality and equality in mind, become more generous over time, you realize, and there are some of you here who know this concept, you like becoming generous, and you like what it looks like to see what your money is doing outside of your own home and in God's kingdom, and it ends up, you get excited for the things that are happening with it because you realize that it's doing more than just what can be done when it stays within. And so because of that, your faith in God grows deeper because you are looking at the things like Jesus is looking at them, hearing the things like Jesus is hearing them, and speaking the way that Jesus is speaking. Your faith grows as this harvest of righteousness grows as well. Number 3, God receives praise. This gift that's being sent to Jerusalem is going to produce thanksgiving to God, Paul says, through you, the Corinthians. So what that means is that as your giving goes to help other people, when they receive it, when those things happen that benefit other people, they give thanks, and ultimately it's thanks to the Lord, but you were the one who facilitated that. And that is something that is perfectly fine and good for us to rejoice in. Lord, we are excited that more people are giving you praise because of the money that you've given to us, that we have now given back in part to you. God receives more praise, and it produces thanksgiving in the hearts of those who receive these gifts. And in fact, God invites us in to take part in his kingdom. And one of the ways that he ministers to other people is through us. That's true outside of finances. Number 4, the gospel spreads. Paul says that this is a test of our obedience. That one of the ways that we respond to the gospel of generosity, right, is that we are giving as well. And so as we give, and as we meet other people who are generous givers, they see in our lives one of the many expressions of the gospel. This is not the only way that the gospel of Jesus Christ is shown in our good works, but it is one of them, and it is one of them that should be remembered. And so the the giving is an obedient confession of this gospel. 5th, practical needs are met. It supplies the needs of the saints. You can rejoice in the specific work that your giving produces, that it is actually doing something and accomplishing something. And here it would be meeting the needs of the saints in Jerusalem. It is not like in the book of James, when he says that they go to somebody who is poor and needy and they say, I pray for you, go and be well. But you can rejoice, as James says, that good works are following faith, that this is one of those ways that it manifests itself. The coat is being given, if you will. 6th and finally, God's kingdom grows. There's a whole subtext to this relationship between Corinth and Jerusalem that's pretty interesting, and it has to do with Jerusalem being almost entirely made up of Jewish Christians. There were disagreements, debates in the early church about that gospel going out to the Gentiles, right? And sort of two parties that were kind of developing, the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians, and how those things worked themselves out. Well, Paul ministered to the Gentile Christians. The Corinthians, most likely almost none of them were Jewish originally. They were pagans worshiping Zeus and other idols beforehand and now have come to Christ. But one of the ways that this gift is working, it is knitting together this community in Christ and most likely drawing the Jerusalem church deeper in affection towards the church in Corinth that they might not be huge fans of otherwise. And so one of the things this does is that God's kingdom is growing because it develops affection and thankfulness for those who are generous. So, this is why we shared with you a couple weeks ago that the update from the Lifeline Pregnancy Center here in Topeka that you generously gave $215,000 to last year. And the reason that we give you updates, why we sometimes have videos telling you what your giving has accomplished, is because we want you to rejoice and be encouraged by these things. That's why we're also try very hard in the language to say, like, we praise God for the one who has given us these gifts so that then we can return them back to his kingdom. It is not that you are being praised, but rather we want you to be encouraged. Because Lifeline Pregnancy Center, over the last year, right, they have been able to grow and expand and meet more people with the gospel and save lives and do all of these things. And as you have done that, hopefully by revealing these things to you, you draw deeper into your relationship with Christ. Not that you would give more necessarily. That is not the reason why we show you those videos. We do it because this is supposed to be something that is a discipline of our Christian living, and we want you to be encouraged. We want you to see the good works that are being done through you. We don't yearn for the glory, but we deeply desire to see that our gifts do good things for God's kingdom. So, how did the Corinthians respond? Right? What did they do? Thankfully, we're actually told in the book of Romans. Romans 15. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem bringing aid to the saints from Macedonia and Achaia. And Achaia, by the way, is the Corinthian region. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. For they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. What Paul's talking about there is that there's this kind of economy of exchange that the gospel has gone out from Jerusalem, and so they are worthy to receive some of these gifts back. But nevertheless, the main point here is, right, he says they were pleased to do it. The Corinthians matched the enthusiasm of the Macedonians. The Corinthians said, "You're right, Paul. You're not telling us what to do. You're not commanding us. You're encouraging us." And ideally, the message of Paul that is received here is that we reflect on the generosity of Jesus, shown through his grace, and it makes us generous as well. We cheerfully give back to God's kingdom as a sign of our faith and obedience to his gospel message. It's one of those things, though, where at this point, whether or not you are working through in your head how this applies to your life, you probably have one of two opinions about the fact that I just talked about this. The first one is that I'm manipulating you emotionally or spiritually so that our church gets more money. That's not it. I'm doing this for the second reason, which is that our Bible talks about it, and you can benefit spiritually if you become more generous. No part of this, even though I recognize the timing of this, I do. It's not lost on me. But there's no part of my application here that says you need to give to the Christmas project. What I'm desiring for you is that you would respond to the gospel as a test of your obedience because you understand the grace of Jesus Christ that was given to you. And furthermore, that when you give, you would draw deeper into it because you realize how rich and joyful of an experience it is to see your money do things for God's kingdom. And furthermore, that you would be released from some of the shackles of Old Testament principles like tithing. And look, if you're set at a certain percentage because that's how you were raised, you know what? Great. But if you want to be released from that and just understand that your generosity and your desire for equality in God's kingdom is what propels us into giving, and that through your heart you determine with your family what that looks like, as a response, I'm overjoyed, okay? There's no part of this that is going to change our relationships with each other. There's no part of this that is going to make any one of us treat you differently because God has gifted us all differently. But my one sort of loving kick in the pants, okay, is this. There have been many people who have gotten away from the concept of generosity by saying, there's no way that I can cheerfully give to God's kingdom without feeling like I am, being compelled or it is reluctant for me, and therefore I won't give it all. And to that I say, I think you've misunderstood the text. Because ultimately what this is about, and I think what that really reveals, even as I have those feelings at times, is a heart that is still focused more on the dollars and cents than the gospel itself. Because if you're able to remove from your sort of thinking the idea that Paul says you need to give this specific amount and realize that God says you get to choose. You get to choose whatever you want to give. That ultimately what that is doing is realizing more and more generosity is being propelled from the gospel and reflecting on the gospel of Jesus Christ that shows us what is to be done. And if we're able to move out of that sense of rules and into one of generous sort of hearts, ultimately God's kingdom is going to be impacted even more. Quick story. Back at my old church, when I was in the youth group, we would always do these dinners or lunches after church to raise money for the mission trip and things like that. And so everybody in the church would come and, into the gymnasium, and all the youth group kids would serve them their lunch, normally like some spaghetti and garlic bread kind of thing. And originally, when we were raising money, we asked that everybody would give $5 to our meal. And so we were coming in, and everybody was giving $5, and everybody was happy to do it. And then Finally, though, we realized that there were a couple people who were saying, we can't really give $5 right now, or that's not going to work for our family. And so we said, not me, the church leadership, they said, just come on in and give whatever you can. And when we made that change and said, give whatever you can, do you know what happened to our funds for going on mission trips? They went a lot higher. Because it wasn't about exactly every person, you need to give $5, you need to give $5, you need to give $5. It was about, we want you to participate in this ministry. Go back to the Macedonians. We want you to desire to have this, see it as a privilege to be a part of God's kingdom. And it's only if we remove compulsion from that example that we're able to draw deep into these things. Final thought. This morning we're going to celebrate communion together as a church. And it might feel like a hard right turn into communion, only if we are still struggling with this idea that generosity needs to be divorced from the gospel itself. The thing that Paul is encouraging us to do is he says, reflect on the gospel of Jesus Christ and allow that to motivate you, wherever it motivates you, and to whatever degree it motivates you. And so this morning, what we're doing as we go to the Lord's table and take it together as brothers and sisters in Christ is we are simply focusing on the grace and generosity of Jesus that he displayed on the cross. And however, as application, that transforms you or changes you or moves you, if you're in that space, that's between you and the Lord. That's certainly not between me and you. So with that, I'm going to pray, and then we're going to go ahead and take the Lord's Supper together. I'll pray, and then I'll step off, and there'll be a time of reflection, and then I'll come back on and we'll do it. Lord, we thank you for today. God, we thank you for your grace and your mercy. Lord, we thank you for your generosity to us. God, we know that money and faith are two things that sometimes feel like oil and water. But God, we desire to be good stewards of the resources that you have given to us. Lord, we desire to be generous people. We don't want to be stingy Christians. But Lord, only insofar as we have reflected on your gospel, not because we are being compelled, not because we are being told, but because Lord, you have given us the freedom, you've set us free to be able to do these sorts of things. And God, I pray that when we give, that we would see the benefits and be encouraged by what it is doing for your kingdom, Lord. Though it might be, as you say, our right hand doesn't know what our left hand is doing, we're not doing it for the praise of others. But God, that we might be able to see how others are praising you, how others are glorifying you, how physical and practical needs are being met, how your gospel is being furthered. Lord, how we are being good stewards, like I've said. Lord, how we are drawing deeper in our relationship with you. God, by your Spirit, help us to see these things. And Lord, here in a moment, as we take your blood and your body, God, might we just consider how it is that you have been generous to us. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I'm going to step off for just 1 minute here, give you a time to reflect, and then when I come back on, we'll take the elements of the Lord's table together. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. On the night when he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, broke it, and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way also he took the cup after supper and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me, for as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Lord, with this body and with this blood, we proclaim your death until you return. Lord, we proclaim the gift of salvation. We proclaim your sacrifice. Lord, we proclaim your generosity to us that was not deserved, and is still not. But Lord, we receive it thankfully. God, I pray that we would continue to walk as people of your kingdom, moved by your body and blood, and living out your gospel in as many ways as we possibly can. God, we thank you for this. Lord, I also pray later on this week, as we go to the light show, God, that there would be, of the thousands who are going to come and see this show, God, that there would be people whose lives are transformed and changed by your gospel. And Lord, that they would be people soon enough by your Spirit who are able to celebrate your body and your blood as believers in your kingdom. Lord, we love you and we thank you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
And we're back. Alan's still here, but also
Hello.
Connor.
Hey-o.
How's it going, Connor?
Hey, it's going great.
Yeah, you're looking very winterish in your green.
Yeah, 'tis the season, right?
Yeah, vest there looks awesome. Very interesting sermon, especially about generous giving. Caused me a little angst in a good way, I would say. But as we start off with talking about your sermon, the thing that I'm glad you talked about a little bit, but this is to me is a big topic because I've had a lot of people over the years at TBC ask me this specific question, and because of my upbringing, it kind of to me was the elephant in the room, and you brought it right up. So good job to you. But like the idea of tithing not being in effect today, or however you want to say that, and my Baptist upbringing was like, it's hard for me. I'm just being 100% honest. Even if I can go with you and say, okay, yes, the Old Testament, the tithe was in effect. New covenant, we don't, maybe that's not in effect today.
Yeah.
My mind still goes to tithing. Sure. I think is ingrained to me when I was so young by Mr. Magracino, my 5th grade Sunday school teacher, that he would specifically pray and thank God that that God allowed us to use 9/10 of everything that we got to earn.
Yeah.
And that's just so ingrained in me. I just wanted to know, have you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
And
so, and I mean, I went to a Baptist seminary, so I mean, we talk about this kind of thing too. Okay, so the first, I think, biggest point to get out of the way is that tithing is like the word tithe, like Sabbath, is a word that is used today and has it's kind of become an umbrella term to mean a number of things, and has various definitions for it that meant something very specific back in the Old Testament. So Sabbath, briefly, we've talked about that, but Sabbath is not really supposed to be used for just a general idea of you taking a day off.
Yeah.
That's fine if you want to say it's a day of rest, or you want to maybe uphold some of the principles of work and rest that were in the Old Testament.
Sure.
But the Sabbath had this very, very specific function. It is not any day you want it to be. Your Friday afternoon is not a Sabbath. It's something that was back in the Mosaic Law. Tithing in much the same way, and I would say to an even greater extent, because it has been used interchangeably with the idea and the concept of just giving or offerings to a church. People say, I'm giving my tithe, and occasionally that means that you are giving 10% to people. And probably for a lot of people who use that word, that's what they say. But churches, will say, give your tithes and offerings now. And it's like, okay, every time we use that, what are we saying? What do we mean? So a tithe, like I said, it's an Old Testament concept. Where does the 10% come from? So the 10%, there are a couple places. One is back in Genesis when Abraham gives Melchizedek 10%. And that's kind of actually a whole thing. Who is Melchizedek? He comes up in the book of Hebrews as a type of Christ early on. He's the priest of Salem, which is basically Jerusalem before it was a thing. And so we've got this figure that even Abraham recognizes as coming from God before priests have been established, that is a type of Christ that comes from Jerusalem that gets a 10th. It's kind of a big thing. But elsewhere, and especially once the Mosaic Law comes around, which, Mosaic Law is just the broader definition for, it's what's initiated with the 10 Commandments, but then is expanded upon as you go through Exodus and Leviticus, especially Leviticus. And so anybody who went with us through Leviticus knows that there are a couple times where, like Leviticus 27 is one of the examples, where you are giving 10% of your crops that you grew or the livestock that you raise, and it's going towards the tabernacle and the temple.
Right.
But when you begin to add up, and not just in Leviticus, there's some in Numbers, Deuteronomy, when you start to add up all the places where people are supposed to be giving tithes and to whom they are giving, some is to the Levites, some is to the temples, some are for feasts, some are for the poor of the land, some are not exactly, they're not the same year after year. There's this whole calculation that comes into it. But every Israelite would have normally given about 23% of everything that they had back to this theocratic government.
23.5%.
Roughly.
Yeah, okay.
Or so. And again, it would sort of
Sure.
shift a little bit. But it's also compounded by the fact that the government back then, it is a theocracy. And so when you're giving to the temple, you are not just supporting the priests, but you're supporting, the government. And later when you give to the king, and when you have the monarchy.
It was all kind of together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right, yeah.
When we get to, so a tithe, though, you get this idea of a tenth from a couple different places. Mm-hmm. And there are some spaces in the Old Testament where absolutely it's like you give a tenth of the XYZ. And actually, there is one spot in the New Testament where giving a tenth is mentioned. And it is when Jesus, he is rebuking a Pharisee for tithing the herbs in his garden.
Yeah.
Okay. And Jesus basically says, you should have continued to do what you were doing.
Right.
While also giving, sort of having the heart. The criticism ultimately is that the man does not have the heart.
Right.
For
He
giving.
was giving, but he wasn't taking care of justice. He wasn't taking care of the other
Yes.
parts of the law that were more important or more important.
Exactly. And so Jesus says you need to do those things while also maintaining sort of this stuff going on in the background. And I think a pretty simple explanation for that, though certainly modern people who would advocate for tithing today, they would perhaps use that passage. But I think a pretty simple example is that really there's no point in time when during Jesus's earthly ministry where he was trying to change the way that Jews were worshiping.
Yeah.
Insofar as, he wanted, he says to the woman at the well, a day will come when you won't worship on the hills, and he's like, okay, well, there will be a time when there's no temple, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But he was a Jew that was giving to the temple, and it's not like Jesus was trying to break that relationship, even though later on that would be the effect of the new covenant. So why take a shot at it? Well, because I think that when we get to 2 Corinthians here, I think it's really instructive that Paul, who is was a Pharisee and is most certainly a very law-abiding Jewish man, never mentioned anything about tithing, mentioned anything about, really this specific thing that needed to take place, and really was normative. That is one of the things that people, I don't want to say make fun of, but it's kind of emblematic of the Mosaic covenant is a bull for this and a lamb for this and 2 doves for this. And it's very formulaic.
Yeah.
And kind of by definition, what Paul says at the end of 1 Corinthians in chapter 16 and here in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 is not formulaic, other than his statement that it should be in proportion with how much you are, or as he says in 16, how you are prospering.
He kind of leaves it up to them to decide what
does.
that is.
Yeah.
And I think that is reflective of a church culture, which would be true for the entire Gentile world and is now true for the vast majority of Christians who are not originally Jewish believers, is that everybody has these different backgrounds, right? And so, like I mentioned in the sermon, you would have very wealthy merchants in Corinth.
Sure.
It was a very unique city because it had ports on 2 sides. And then you would have people who were slaves.
Yeah.
And so this idea of saying everybody, though he's advocating for equality, that equality is going to come from sometimes a difference in the way that giving is happening.
Equality maybe in a different way that we think of equality, not everyone giving the same percentage, but everyone being equal in the
Yes.
sense. Yeah.
And that goes back to his philosophy, 1 Corinthians 12, when he's talking about the different gifts, spiritual gifts that are in the body of the church.
Yeah.
It's not that everybody goes out and does the same job, but rather that, that's his thing about there's an eye, there's an ear, there's a nose. So that's not an argument for not supporting tithing, but in sum, what I would say is that there's not really a place that we look and find in the New Testament that tithing as a phrase is used.
Yeah.
None of the guidelines for tithing that are in the Mosaic Law are presented other than that passage that I was talking to you about with the Pharisee. And I think that in context has more to do with his background.
I personally, though, like I said at the beginning, it kind of causes me some inner angst sometimes. I think that's good to work things out and not just to go through the motions, right? But for me to have a percentage makes sense because I'm fairly emotional, and like I think that I could forget sometimes to give sometimes, but at least this is like, okay, we can set up like a draft, like a bank draft, or like some of the practical things there too.
And I think that is exactly what you should be doing. I mean, not necessarily the bank draft, though. Sure. There is some wisdom in that. But I mean, nevertheless, even though it might not be 10% or 23.5% or whatever, he's still saying it's a proportion.
Right. And I thought that was interesting. You point that out. I had never thought that through. Even if it wasn't 10%, it should be in proportion.
Yeah.
And So and generously giving. So it's like.
And then the other thing is, I think that the reason 10% is stuck is because anecdotally, it's like a number that requires sacrifice. Mm-hmm. It changes the way that you're living your life. You can't buy the same car. You can't, afford the same house if you're giving 10% of your income. But it's also not debilitating.
Right.
And so I think that it has also just kind of natively found itself. And then I think, there are some pastors who, some of them, I think have no thought. And maybe I'm wrong. I don't think I am, but maybe I'm wrong about this whole system, but maybe they just don't understand it.
Yeah.
Or then I would also say there are some who are perfectly happy setting aside this concept that tithing is an Old Testament idea and saying, well, just as like on all the, the stewardship lessons and stuff, they go to Malachi, do not rob the storehouses of God. And it's like, okay, in context, that's not what Malachi is talking about. Right. But anyhow, so I think they're just more using it for the purpose of moving people, right? And not necessarily worrying about the theology.
I think that just the idea too, amongst people that were raised in the church and are comfortable with that topic, tithe kind of becomes insider language of, that we know exactly what you're talking about too. Yeah,
that's very true. So you talk about like application. I mean, I spoke with a couple people on Sunday. They're like, well, we tithe. And it's like, okay. I mean, you give 10%.
Gross or net? On the gross or the net or on the...
One very quick thing, though, you brought up that is interesting is that as electronic means for giving have sort of grown, it has made it easier, I think, for people to sort of set this up in a way that... is sort of consistent and in keeping. I mean, that's 1 Corinthians.
Just automatically happening.
Exactly. 1 Corinthians 16, he was telling them to do it weekly. Yeah. He's like, set this aside so that basically when the time comes for me to visit you, it's not like I'm collecting this huge bill, but rather it's built up over time.
Right.
And I think that's a very instructive way for us to live as well, giving to the church is, there are certain people for tax reasons who might give lump sum gifts, but for a lot of people doing something monthly makes it a lot easier to budget and stuff like that.
Yeah. And honestly, just won't forget to, first write a check, which is, okay, I don't just carry the cash around usually. And writing a check, we don't even have, our checkbook.
Though I will say growing up, I remember my mom every Sunday, my mom writing a check while we were sitting in our pew and putting it into the plate as it passed by. And there have been some folks, when we got rid of passing plates here at TBC because of COVID, that's when it went away.
Right.
They're like, well, why don't we bring passing plates back?
Yeah.
Right? Because of how it is instructive symbolically for kids and younger generations to see their parents doing
When I
it.
was younger, my dad would write the check before we got to church, but then he would let us kids take turns putting it in the offering plate.
Yeah.
I remember that. I'm like, I don't know. It just felt kind of like, oh, I'm you know, wasn't really giving any of my money, but like our family's money, I guess. But it made me feel like part of the service.
Well, and if you have like automatic giving set up, you're not having that moment where you're writing the check.
Yes.
You don't have that moment where you're putting the money in the offering plate, which, as you talked about in the sermon, there is a feeling that you get, an emotional response
That's
when
true.
giving. You make it automatic, you lose that
I'm
aspect
so glad
to
you
it.
brought this up, because this perfectly encapsulates like the division between or the combination rather of the spiritual and the practical side of these things. Because if like there's a psychological component to it, you know, if somebody says, well, I'm going to wait until the end of the year to do it, or I always want to be writing it, like sometimes maybe there's a bigger journey there for that person and what it takes to write out that check and just put it in the box, you know, and make that habit a very intentional, tactile habit of putting a check in a wooden box, as we have, you know, in the auditoriums. The thing, going back to the passing of the plates, part of the reason that we haven't brought it back is that, two reasons. One is that a lot of what people want is not actually a plate or a bag being passed around, because everybody at one point in time or the other thought that was slightly awkward.
Yeah,
it's true. So it's not really that they want that. That's never what they're saying.
True.
What they are saying is they like what it meant.
Right.
And you can replicate that in other ways.
Right.
You know, the way that conversation is happening. And also, I think it does, a parent who really wants to show their children that they're giving it, there are other ways to do it than having the church pass a plate. But the other reason is partly because electronic means started becoming more popular. I think people sort of forgot that those last like couple years that we were passing the plate or the bag, you'd get to the end of like all the rows, and there was like a $5 bill in there. There was almost nothing.
That's true, right.
And so in a way, it became kind of like this, I don't want to say embarrassing, that's not the attitude, but it wasn't reflective of actually sort of the giving that was taking place. It made it look like everybody was being super stingy. In reality, that somebody's just like, I just got it drafted from my bank account.
Trying to recreate that moment, I guess you could say you could have a time. Everyone get out your phones.
Yeah.
And you know,
We'll do it together. Everybody press
send. Crash the server.
So here's one thing I want to say to that, and then we can move on from tithing. But for the people in that boat, one of my recommendations would be that as a family, especially with a family with kids, but just as a husband and wife, or even somebody to share that with. If you're single, you know that you have a friend that maybe you talk to about this, but that if you are somebody who likes the convenience of giving, you know, electronically or whatever, that you would set up some regular intervals. I mean, if you're doing it, you're somebody who likes scheduling. So that you would set up some regular intervals where you have that conversation that takes place of, am I giving the amount that is, you know, generous, sacrificial, where I can be cheerful? Am I, you know, putting it towards the things that really matter? Am I, that you are able to have that conversation on a frequent enough basis that you can include other people in it and still get some of the
makes sense.
The benefits. Anyhow.
Yeah.
Well, earlier you talked about pastors kind of misrepresenting passages in order to get people to give more or start giving. Well, one of the thoughts I couldn't help but have was during Paul's writings to Corinth, that some of the language he uses could kind of be on that line, appealing to people's pride, appealing to their honor, appealing to their emotions. And so I couldn't help but wonder, like, what's the line of manipulation and getting someone to gladly give?
Yeah.
And I guess a personal note on that is I used to work in a radio station and we had to do support drives, and that always felt really weird because you're doing a lot of emotional manipulation to get people to want to respond, and you have to break through that barrier, and it's hard. So I just didn't know if you had any thoughts on that kind of stuff.
It's a great question. It's a really great question. I'm curious, when you were working at the station, did the internal communications about how to talk about these things, did they ever kind of give you the heebie-jeebies?
Oh yeah, heebie-jeebies were full force.
Yeah. So, the unsatisfying answer is I think it has to do with the person's heart who's presenting that information. But to be more specific, I do think it matters how for the reason that you are motivating people to give. So if, like, I think Paul's point is that the Corinthians are going to benefit and are going to receive something even greater than what they have given monetarily if they pursue this. And so his whole thing about, I'm not coming in as an authority, but I am giving you advice,
encouraging,
because it's profitable for you. He actually has that phrase. He says, this advice is profitable for you, which is such an interesting choice of words, right? That's profitable. When in reality, from a financial sense, it most likely wasn't. But that's sort of the whole gambit, is that you give into this thing that is bigger than you, that is eternally weighted, and you do receive more spiritually in return. Mm-hmm. And in the grand scheme of things, if we're looking beyond this life, that is worth more. But if the end goal is simply to raise money for XYZ, then I think that's where some of the motivational factors can kind of become suspect. And so that's why, I said, like, look, I recognize the timing. It felt weird to, have the renovation project that we were going to, like, literally I pray and then it's like, all right, I'll meet you up there to walk through the student ministry space. But here's the background though, is as was obvious in chapters 8 and 9, there was enough content. And in a very early draft of the series for 2 Corinthians, I had this as 2 separate sermons. Mm-hmm. And I chose not to do it and make it one sermon, because next weekend is when, Lord willing, a decent number of people from the light show will be coming to church. Yeah. And so I'm like, well, the last thing I want them to hear is their first sermon in a church is me, or, maybe in a long time, is, hey, you should be giving generously. Right. Yeah. And so there is a little bit of insider conversation to some of these things where it's like, look, if you're a visitor, if you're just checking things out, I mean, right, these principles of generosity are true across the board, but I'm not trying to stand up there and just say, like, you really need to give to our general fund.
Right. It's almost like basic PR rules. Like, you want them to not dread coming here or even just stop entirely just because of something like that.
Well, and also, I forgot to mention this, I think, during the second service, but if people listen to the podcast, they'll have heard it. But I said, this is why, as a church, we share, like, what happened. Alan, you made the video, like what happened with Lifeline Pregnancy Center, what $215,000 accomplishes. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I had a conversation with another Topeka pastor, it was a couple months ago, but the whole lunch conversation, or a significant part, was just, how do you talk about and share about the successes of the church, in this case, a financial one, in a way that truly is giving glory to God? Because there's what's so funny is you can do those things, those same exact things. Hey, let's talk about how much money we raised for this thing. And it can very easily go into the ditch and sound like you're either bragging or you're just, you're pompous because we raised, we have the ability to raise a lot of money, and that's significant. And so, like, how do we couch those things truly in praise to God, which is one of the 6 things that Paul says. He's like, it's why we take, when we drop off granola bars to, is it Robinson Middle School last summer, after they had asked for those things, and they came to us, they said, we want these things, a couple school supply things. We do a church drive for it, and then we take a picture of us dropping it off. Right. And there's 2 sides to that, and it's like, well, that could be seen as a photo op. Yeah. And I guess in some ways it is, but ultimately the intention, and it does matter on the heart, is that people would see that the things that they're giving to, it doesn't just go off into a black void. It's not just like, well, I trust that they're doing good stuff with what I'm giving and what I'm putting money towards, rather we're saying like, hey, as a form of like responsibility, accountability, stewardship, all that stuff, what we said we are going to do with the money is what we're doing. Look how it's benefiting people.
Yeah.
But it can go sideways.
And the motivation for that is wanting to share with everybody what everybody helped do, right? Not every person could take out time off work and go over, nor should we all march over and hand these granola bars all together. Yeah. But it's interesting as you're talking about this. I just feel like it's kind of interesting, but I feel like the church, and maybe it should be, but has a higher level of scrutiny. My son Daxon is playing upward basketball, and the first thing they asked me to do is pay money for him to play basketball.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone there thought, oh, well, what are you using the money for? What are we, that kind of thing. So I just feel like there's a little, but maybe there should be because it's a higher standard, but I don't know. Sometimes I just wonder about how far we're going there to do that. So
yeah, I think so. Alan, you mentioned that you used to work for a radio station where you had to do this. I used to work for a nonprofit where we talked about money and asked people for money quite a bit, and my salary came from the fact that it was raised by this nonprofit, and so I think that there's an element of that has just made it. I'm a little bit more comfortable talking about money, or at the very least saying, I mean, I was certainly uncomfortable on Sunday. Mm-hmm. That is consistently one of the topics that people tell me they don't like to hear sermons on.
Sure. Makes sense.
And so, and then that you can already anticipate some of the attitudes in the room, or the person who very quickly you can tell is not interested in the fact that you're about to talk about this for 35 minutes. Anyhow, but I do think that there's a bit of American culture here where there's a wall that we want to put up between God and our finances. Mm-hmm. And I think that the number of times that Scripture talks about money, and specifically, like you can't have two masters, God or money, and you can only serve one of them. I think there are things like that we would do better to sometimes just speak about more openly and freely. Mm-hmm. And I was trying on Sunday to not apologize over and over again for the fact that we're talking about this.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's sometimes how it's also presented, is like, I joked about it at the very beginning, but not throughout the whole sermon. I'm like, I know you hate this. I know you don't want to talk about it. I know it's uncomfortable. Let's just get through this together. It's like, well, I think if we had a more open hand in the way that we viewed our finances, that though it's totally reasonable that people might not, would be repulsed by that story of my former pastor that I told at the very beginning. Like that is a terrible story, and that's why I told it. But also, what I would say is that, like, when he would talk with the church so often about finances, he had a point. He had a point. Like, people need to more willingly understand that their finances are tied to, or sometimes if their stinginess can be tied to, that's how I would phrase that. Their stinginess financially can be tied to a lack of faith, really, in the things that God is carrying out. And that one of the ways, this is why Paul said it's a test. He says, this is one of the ways that you are obedient to the gospel of God, is that you say with one of the most important things in our life, which is our finances, that you support this message, not just verbally, but with action.
That does kind of go into the question then still that I don't feel like I quite got answered about that fine line of convincing people to give and manipulating them to give. Because, I don't know, Paul's saying this is a test. It's like, are you going to pass it or are you going to fail this test right now?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, it just feels
So I
tough.
think one really clear line that is abused by churches. So this isn't necessarily nonprofit in general, but churches can abuse, pastors can abuse. When you talk about spiritual manipulation, is you begin to, and this is, I think, a pretty common thing in the prosperity gospel, is that you are promising, or at the very least, heavily suggesting that by giving money, this spiritual authority is telling you that blessings from God are going to come.
it's like going to be worth it for
material
you to do this.
possessions.
And so there's, it's not, it goes beyond just you will make money or you will be blessed, but somebody like understanding the power dynamics there, that there are certain things that a prosperity gospel preacher or just a pastor in general can say about what God says that people are going to go, well, the pastor said that.
Yeah.
And so you have to carry that weight, I think, in an appropriate sense. So trying to answer your question specifically, if you begin to set it up like making these direct connections to God favoring you, right? There's no part of this conversation that God will love you more if you do these things, right? There's obedience present, but that's not really a matter of manipulation. That's just a true statement. You're being obedient when you do these things. But those kind of background motivations that Paul was bringing up, really what he was promising them is that they would draw deeper into the gospel and that they would find fulfillment in what they were pursuing. And that if there was any financial, because he does include that, if there's any financial renewal, like God brings back to you more than you gave, he says it's ultimately so that you might give more. So there's no part of his spiritual sort of argument, I would say, that takes into account the security of the believer, like their faith. You know, your faith in God is in question. We're just saying, well, your obedience to God is sort of one of the things that's being brought up here. But your salvation, your obedience to him, when you start to make things very personal, like your health, you know, like, well, if you want to recover from this or your child is struggling in this way, you need to continue to pour into. I think it takes into account the way that financial conversations are usually leveraged to make somebody to focus on the person benefiting. But yeah, I would be very careful in my personal conversations with people, you know, that I'm not. So it's funny.
And I'm sorry if I should cut you off, but you want the conviction to come from God, not from someone putting outside pressure on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's probably one of the keys to
exactly.
leaving room for God to communicate, the Holy Spirit to communicate as well.
And that's why I felt like it was important to say, like, I don't know if you're going to follow through with this.
Sure.
Like, there's no part of our relationship that is dictated by how much or how little that somebody is giving. And I think that's good for people to see because it sort of clears the runway for them to be able to pursue this in hopefully an honest fashion and not doing it for some ulterior motive. So how many things are you stacking onto this equation besides the fact that we're being obedient to God and we're doing it because Christ has been generous to us? Yeah. The number of additives there can make it. Alan, maybe I just flip it on you. Like, are there times where you feel like things do become manipulative or abusive in the way that people talk about it?
It just kind of comes down to when it gets into people's emotions a lot and they feel almost obligated to at some point based on the way they're being convinced. And so working at like the radio station as an example is my job was to convince people to give by recording people's stories of people who have gave and having this emotional tug that was like, because of your gift, people's lives are being changed or they're getting hope. And convincing them in that way can sometimes feel very like, I don't know, just like that emotional tug could feel fake. Yeah. And I want it to be as genuine as possible, which goes right into what you said about the person asking's motives need to be right.
So I grew up Methodist. I had a number of people on Sunday. This was not just one story. Share with me back in their Methodist churches, and this was normally like, hey, this was when I was a kid, Methodist churches, but they would have their deacons come around 2 by 2 to their homes on an annual basis, and they'd knock and they'd say, all right, we want to know how much money you're making, and we want you to sign this pledge card saying how much money you're going to give to the church, which is typically they're going to say it's a tithe, right? And so we're going to have you sign this, and then at the end of the year, if the family hadn't given much money, it's like, well, hey, you had said you were going to give this much money based upon. So That to me is manipulation.
Yeah. Do they then expect you to give reasons like, well, I lost my job? Like, I just, yeah.
And you know what's wild is the people.
That's
like,
interesting.
There's a couple I was talking to. They were probably in their 60s. That was sharing this story with me, and the wife. It was like, she's like, I remember them coming in and how awkward that was and how weird that was as a kid to have that happen to me.
It is quite awkward, I would say.
And so,
I mean, it's not even just awkward. That's like scary, honestly.
So there's a weird way though that you can the spiritual power dynamics at play. And this is why, flow it back to Paul, I think that he was so intent on saying, I am not commanding you to do this. Now, he is their, sort of their spiritual father. He says he's giving advice.
His word carries a lot of weight.
Obviously, what he is saying was persuasive. But I think that ultimately, let's put in a different alternate reality where he says, you must do this. They're all like imperative statements. You must do this. You must do this. You need to give this. It completely changes the tone when later on he would say, and you must be cheerful when you do this. Mm-hmm. Really, the only way that I think the cheerfulness can come through is if you're not, finding it compulsory and you're not finding it to be a significant hardship.
Or manipulated into giving
manipulative,
it,
any of those things. And so the only way I think Paul could have had that conversation is the way that he did, keeping in mind, this is important, that the Corinthians had said they wanted to do it.
Right.
So this is even still a little bit different than just cold calling somebody and saying, hey, would you give? Because they're like, hey, we want to give money to this cause. And then they're just like, nah. And he's like, well, hey, now one of the sections we skipped over on Sunday is he says, look, you and I are going to be ashamed if you don't complete this. And you're like, well, that seems manipulative. But it's like, well, what happened was they said they wanted to give money. Paul's like, great, I will tell people because this takes months, if not, years. He's talking about the next time I visit you, I'll pick up this gift. He's like, people know about this. This community is small. Mm-hmm. And he's like, well, now if you shirk back on this, what is that saying about you? What does it say about the church in Jerusalem? What does it say about my authority? What does it say about my reliability? Yeah.
And he's holding them accountable for what they said they do instead of like trying to get them to do something they never said they were going to do in the first place.
Yeah. So I'm sure there were still some people though who are like, the fact that, he talked about this on Sunday, that was spiritual manipulation. He should never use the Bible to talk about giving. And the long and short of it is the Bible talks about giving on its own. If we're going to cover it, it talks about it anyway. Right. I still think there are some, I think, Alan, we always need to be careful about the way we communicate these things as a church. But yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, next week, we continue on with 2 Corinthians.
Yeah, that's right.
And will there be this is something I was thinking about, will there be a 2 Corinthians message for December 24th as well? Or are we stepping aside from that?
It'll be baby in a manger.
All right. Well, something to look forward to for the next couple weeks.
There we go.
All right. Thank you, guys.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to the TBC Extra Podcast. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We drop an episode every Wednesday, and on the first Friday of each month, we have an extra episode. Extra! With stories, pastoral teaching, interviews, and more.
See you next time, and have a great rest of your week.